Hello, and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This is our mini-episode where I will answer comments and questions from the previous episode, as well as provide you, the listener, with oral histories from those who were there. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today we'll be continuing our discussion on the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. The film focuses on the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Tora, Tora, Tora was directed by Richard Fleischer in the United States and Toshio Masuda in Japan. Produced by Elmo Williams and based off of Gordon Prang's book At Dawn We Slept, Tora was lauded for its historical accuracy in regards to the events leading up to and the attack on Pearl Harbor. The film was considered a financial disappointment in the United States, but was a moneymaker in Japan.
The Arizona burned for 3.5 days after that. 1 million pounds of ammunition exploded, aviation gas, fuel oil. They lost 1,177 men on the Arizona. Just a horrible day.
That was USS Arizona survivor Don Stratton recalling how his ship was destroyed during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Arizona suffered the highest loss of life of any United States naval vessel in history. 1,177 sailors and Marines died aboard the ship. Only 335 survived the attack, Don obviously being one of them. Over 900 of Arizona's crew remain aboard her to this day. One of the things we talked about in the main episode, which is something we generally don't do, but for this movie especially, it may be appropriate, is talk about what-ifs. You could debate these ad nauseum, which we started to do in the main episode, but stopped just shy. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, was there actually anything that the United States could have done to either stop or be better prepared against the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor? And there were early signs that something was coming up. One of the earliest warnings of something being awry occurred about 0630 hours on the morning of the 7th of December. The supply ship Antares was just outside the mouth of the harbor towing a barge when she was approached by the destroyer USS Ward. High overhead, a Navy PBY patrol plane was circling the Antares, apparently observing something in the water, not just the tug, or not just the ship. As the Ward approached her, her helmsman, Seaman Rainbig, noticed a black shape sticking out of the water astern of the Antares, between her and the barge she was towing. What was originally thought to be a buoy, and that's what they initially thought it was. It looked like a buoy had gotten tangled up in her towing line. Now appeared to be the conning tower of a small submarine. The OOD, or Officer of the Deck, Lieutenant Gepner, recognized the object for what it was and immediately called the skipper, who was a Lieutenant Outerbridge, to come see for himself. Outerbridge was awoken from his slumber. He was sleeping in his quarters right behind the bridge, and he took a look through the binoculars at what Gepner was showing him, and immediately sounded general quarters. He recognized the shape for what it was. It was the conning tower of a submarine. The time was 0640 hours. So this is a little over 2 hours before the Japanese first struck Pearl Harbor. What Outerbridge was seeing was, in fact, the conning tower of a Japanese midget submarine. The submarine was trying to sneak into Pearl Harbor and escape the torpedo net, or the anti-submarine nets, rather, by following very closely the Antares as it was getting ready to get back into the harbor. As the destroyer came to life, the PBY that was circling above dropped smoke pots to mark the object's location, and it dropped smoke pots right on top of the Japanese submarine. As Ward closed the distance to the target, it became very, very clear what they were looking at was a sub. The sub was running awash, and by that it means that her conning tower was sticking out about 2 feet above the water. Knowing full well that there were no submarines authorized to be in that area, Outerbridge ordered his gun crews to open fire. There had been orders set out days before that any unauthorized submarines operating in the area would be taken under fire immediately, because there were a lot of the U.S. fleet, especially those out at sea under Admiral Halsey, were operating under war conditions, even though there was no war yet. There were planes flying with ammunition in them. The weapons were loaded. The crews were ready to go. They were ready to fight. This is no different for the Ward. She was under orders, as I said, to sink anything that was in the water that was not flying an American flag. So what she did is Ward swung to starboard, and her number one gun crew opened fire, firing the first shots for the United States in the Second World War during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She missed. Her second shot came from the number 3 gun crew. They opened fire immediately after number 1 gun crew did, and this shot struck the base of the conning tower of the submarine. The submarine slowed down, bobbed, and kind of tossed around in Ward's wake. and then she slowly sunk. As Ward passed over, she dropped a bunch of depth charges on top of her, and there was oil seemed to be floating to the water and a giant black bubble of oil and debris coming out of the water. It was very obvious that they had sunk the submarine. At 6:53 in the morning, 06:53 hours, Outerbridge sent a message into Pearl Harbor that said, quote, attacked, fired on, depth-bombed, and sunk submarine operating in defensive area, unquote. The first shots of Pearl Harbor had been fired, not by the Japanese, but by the old World War I destroyer Ward. Outerbridge's message was received and decoded by 0712. The message immediately sent up the chain where it languished in discussion between the SINCPAC duty officer and the 14th Naval District Ops officer, who both tried to determine whether or not the message was serious and real. Time's ticking. Together, these men decided to await further developments. In typical red tape fashion, higher-ups debated what to do next and how to handle the situation, all the while the real men who were doing the fighting and were trying to get the job done waited for their superiors to make up their minds as to what to do, thus holding up the progress. Now, the Ward had sunk the submarine, and it was gone. It was at the bottom of the Pacific. But later on in the morning, she ran into another one. She ran into another Japanese midget submarine and fired on it, dropped depth charges on it, and actually I don't believe she sunk that one, but she certainly did sink the first one. Another of the early warnings came in at about 0706. At Opano Point, a radar operator named Joseph Lockhart stared at his radar screen in disbelief. On it, he saw what appeared to be an enormous flight of aircraft coming from the north towards Oahu. He immediately picked up the phone and made a call and reported, quote, large number of planes coming in from the north 3 degrees east, unquote. The message was relayed to the officer on duty at Fort Shafter, who thought about the report and dismissed it. Lockhart asked to speak to the lieutenant who was in charge there, who then got on the phone. Lockhart explained what he was seeing and where it was coming from. The lieutenant who was on the phone, who was his second day on duty at that station, thought about it some more, remembered that the Navy's carriers were out to sea, and remembered that a flight of B-17s were coming in from the mainland of the United States, from that general direction. Of course, what Lockhart was seeing was not B-17s or United States Navy planes, but it was the incoming Japanese first wave of attackers. The lieutenant told Lockhart, quote, don't worry about it, unquote, and hung up the phone. The lieutenant was a gentleman named Kermit Tyler. Tyler was a fresh Army Air Forces fighter pilot who had been assigned the duty of pursuit officer at Fort Shafter that particular Sunday morning, actually Saturday night when he got there Sunday morning. He'd only had that duty once before. Tyler had been assigned there by his commanding officer and Major Berkwith, and so he could learn how radar worked. He wasn't really there to do anything else but just to watch how the planes were plotted and how radar worked, because radar was a new thing for the United States. He had no real job other than just to observe that morning's operations, whatever they may be. Berkwith told him, quote, keep your eyes peeled, unquote. It's the only orders Tyler had. History has blamed, a lot of people have blamed Kermit Tyler wrongly blamed Kermit Tyler for being responsible for the supposed lack of American response to their early warnings, and that's just not true. Let's hear from Kermit Tyler himself, and let's hear what Colonel Tyler has to say about that fateful morning.
Nothing happened really until about 6:30, and there were a very few scattered plots of airplanes of various kinds, but there was no way for me to tell what they were. Elliot was, the two of them decided to stay on, and they were supposed to be off at 7, actually, but and their meal truck was late getting there, so they decided to operate the equipment, and Lockhart was somewhat experienced, so he was teaching the other one what he knew about this thing. Almost immediately they had a huge blip indicating a large number of airplanes. He thought his equipment was breaking down or something because it was so large. He didn't say how many airplanes it might be, however. They talked a bit about back and forth whether they should report it, so they finally agreed that they would call it in. And that's when I got the call at 7:15. Well, I had a friend who was a bomber pilot, and periodically, they would send B-17s, like in bunches of about a dozen airplanes, to the Far East, and so I thought, this is bigger than he's ever had an opportunity to see, so it makes sense to that they must be the B-17s. I thought, well, these are the B-17s. As a matter of fact, the base operations officer was in the tower at Hickam, and the base commander was down there with various other officers awaiting the arrival of the B-17s. So as I sized all this up, I thought, it has to be the B-17s. And so I said, don't worry about it. You know, I hadn't the slightest inkling of a doubt that it was anything but friendly aircraft. I mean, whatever. But I just felt somehow I felt that I was destined to be the one to do that. I don't know why.
Colonel Tyler was a good man, and certainly not to blame for the lack of response to the Japanese threat. As we debated in the main episode, if the United States Army Air Forces had scrambled what fighters they could, in my personal opinion, the losses would have been worse in terms of human casualties. If the United States or the United States Army Air Forces had heeded the Opana Point radar station's warning, had it been deciphered for what it really was, Hickam, Kaneohe, Eva, and Wheeler Fields could have scrambled aircraft, sure. How many? That's debatable. In that event, the aircraft losses probably would not have been as high as they actually were because all the aircraft were caught on the ground. There could have been some that theoretically could have escaped. But as I said earlier, the pilot casualties, in my opinion, certainly would have been higher. When you're on the ground and you're a pilot and somebody's shooting at you, you got a place to go. You can run, you can go jump in a hole, you can go hide behind a tree, you can do something. But when you're in the air, you got no place to hide. And the main American fighter on Oahu that morning, Army Air Forces fighter, was the P-40. And while the P-40 gave a pretty good account of itself during the war, the king of the skies of that period of the war was the Japanese A6M0. It was a fantastic airplane. It was something that was unrivaled in the air until the deployment of the F-6F Hellcat in 1943. But American pilots would have been unaware of what the hell was going on, and they were green as grass, and you could point to the success of two fighter pilots in particular, Kenneth Taylor and Walsh, who did shoot down several Japanese planes during the attack, but they didn't tangle with any Zeros. And had they tangled with the escorting Zeros, of which there were many, they might have gotten lucky and gotten a few kills, but it probably would not have gone quite as well. So the human casualties, in my opinion, would have been significantly higher. As to the question, what could have happened if the Ward's message was interpreted correctly, in my opinion, again, unfortunately, not very much. Would the losses have been less had the submarine's report been read on time and actually said, hey, this is real, we got a real problem out here, there's enemy submarines outside of our harbor, and our destroyers just sunk one? Would the losses to the American fleet have been less? Probably not, unfortunately. They would have likely been the same, or at least close. It took hours for ships the size of the Arizona or the cruiser New Orleans to get up steam and get out of the harbor. It wasn't as easy as switching the ship on and rolling out. It didn't work like that. You didn't turn the key and put the throttle to the firewall and go. It doesn't work like that. In those days, ships had to build up steam, so they had to light off their boilers. And it took a long time for a ship of that size, like a battleship or a cruiser, to build up enough steam to move, much less move with any kind of haste. And it generally took about 2 to 3 hours for a battleship to work up steam just to move away from a pier. And not even talking about, moving away and then opening it wide open to get the hell out of the harbor. It would have taken 4 hours at the very least. And you're talking about 8 battleships in the harbor. It would have been a traffic jam. It would have been a mess, an absolute bigger mess probably than it actually was. It would have just taken too much time. The exception to that, of course, is the USS Nevada, and I briefly mentioned that in the main episode. The Nevada had been working up her steam for some time before the attack on the orders of the officer of the deck, Ensign Joseph Tausig. Tausig ordered one other boiler to be lit in order to switch power. He was going to transfer power. All ships had at least one boiler lit when there were people aboard. And most of the ships had people aboard, specifically the battle wagons, because they had some sailors on liberty and the other ones were aboard ship. Unfortunately, on that Sunday morning, the vast majority of them, on all of them, were aboard ship, hence the reason for the high casualties, specifically on the Arizona. But anyhow, he was going to transfer power from one boiler to the other, so at that time he ordered the second one to be lit. And this is at about 6:30, 7 o'clock in that morning. So by the time the Japanese attack was in full throat, if you will, Nevada actually had 2 boilers lit, and she had enough power to move. And she was the only capital ship, and by capital ship I mean battleship, to be able to move during the entire attack. And there's really, really impressive footage, and there's photographs of Nevada steaming out of the harbor, and it was a thrilling sight to the sailors who were aboard these sinking battleships. Now, Nevada hadn't been hit, but she hadn't been fatally hit during the opening stages of the attack. And about 0840 that morning, she got underway. And this is, during the attack, she's moving. And you got to understand what the sight of that had to have been for those sailors aboard those ships. At that time, battleships were the queens of the seas. And here's one of our ships that's been under attack. She's making headway out of the harbor. And as she passed some of the burning and sinking vessels in the harbor, sailors cheered, and they were screaming and hollering because they thought the Nevada was going to go out there and go get them. And unfortunately, or fortunately rather, she did not. She came under heavy attack as she was moving, and she wound up being beached at Hospital Point, not to save the harbor or the entrance to the harbor, but she just didn't want to get sunk in deeper waters. One of the aspects of the Pearl Harbor tragedy that is not spoken of often is that of the massive salvage and rescue effort that started in the minutes after the attack began and the first ships were hit. Rescuing those trapped inside of the sunken ships lasted for days after the attack. However, those unable to be saved had to be retrieved from their vessels so that proper burial could be performed. One of the men who performed that task was a gentleman named Sterling Cale. Sterling Cale was a pharmacist mate from Illinois, and he helped drag people out of the water during the attack. And 2 days later, was assigned the grisly task of retrieving the dead aboard the still smoking battleship Arizona. Cale, along with 10 other men, clambered aboard the smoking hulk of the great ship and set about their emotionally and physically taxing duty. Let's hear what Sterling has to say about recovering the dead aboard the battleship Arizona.
He came on when he said, "Cale, on Friday, pick up 10 men, go out on the ferry and start removing the people from the Arizona." I said, "But sir, I never been aboard a battle wagon. I don't know anything about it." Arizona. He said, "Don't worry," he said, "you learn after you get out there." Okay, sir. About the first thing we saw, something blowing off the ship, something black. What is that? Oh, must be the ashes from somebody that burned down to the deck, because the Arizona had burned for 2.5 days. Poor, just sort of sank down and said a few tears. What I'm going to do if there's more of those black ashes blowing off the ship? I don't know who they are. They'll be unknown. I can't stop them. So I guess I stand there about 10 minutes meditating what I'm going to do, and suddenly, hey, I got 10 men over there waiting for me to tell them what to do. So I sprang back into action and said, "Hey, men, find the body, bring it in, we'll put him in a sea bag, send him up to Red Hill for temporary burial." To continue on, we went ahead over to the front end of the Arizona. The ladder there, 100 bunch of men had gone up the ladder, and the fire had caught them and been reduced to solid charcoal, only about 3 foot tall and all fused together. I tried to spud them apart to put them in the sea bag, and sometimes the arm would come out, or the leg or the head, and just pick up whatever I could and put one man and put them in there. I only picked up about 129 people off the Arizona. Like I said, they're about the same thing. We couldn't go down below the second deck, so the mess hall's on the second deck, that's about as far as we can go. And we couldn't go any farther down in the ship to pick up bodies.
Beginning on December 7th, minutes after the first Japanese bombs and torpedoes struck, as I said, salvage and rescue efforts began. The official Navy salvage effort lasted for several years, really ending with the righting and refloating of the capsized battleship Oklahoma on November 3rd, 1943. Oklahoma never saw service again, being decommissioned on the 1st of September 1944, and she sunk in a storm as she was being towed back to the United States for scrapping in 1947. Nearly every ship sunk or damaged at Pearl, except for the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the Utah, saw service again. All of the battleships, except those just mentioned, saw combat again. The first to see service again were the Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee, all in 1942. A fitting ending to the Pearl Harbor salvage story occurred on the night of October 25th, 1944. In the Battle of Surigao Strait in the Philippines, 4 of the salvaged Pearl Harbor battleships, the Tennessee, the California, the West Virginia, and Maryland, engaged Japanese surface units and helped destroy the two of the Japanese battleships, the Japanese battleship Fuso and the Yamashiro, and the last battleship versus battleship fight in history. Raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, the old battle wagons exacted revenge on the Japanese in classic naval fashion. Thanks so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss the 2016 film Anthropoid. If you'd like to listen to the complete oral histories you heard today, please visit our digital collections at worldwar2online.org. That's www.the2online.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.